Okay, yeah, so just as the title says, I'm here to talk to you all about accessibility, why it's super important, how we're dealing with it where I work at Vox Media, and I'm also going to leave you with some tips, so hopefully you can start implementing it in your work. And like he said, I'm Palanzi, your second Allie of the day, and I'm a front-end engineer at Vox Media, working on our platform. And that's my Twitter if you want to follow me. I post a lot of pictures of my cat. And then also, if you need to follow along with the slides at all, you can see it at this link. So how many of you currently include accessibility in your workflow? Okay, that's awesome. So hopefully a lot of you are familiar. So accessibility, or A11Y, or Ally, or Ally, if you want, refers to the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people who experience disabilities. In 2001, the World Health Organization redefined disability as a mismatch in interaction between the features of a person's body with the features of the environment in which they live. As designers and developers and people who make stuff, our work can create or remove these mismatches in interaction. We're in a really cool place working on the web because the impact of disability is radically changed. The web removes barriers to communication and interaction that many people face in the physical world. So it's a really cool place for us to be in, and we can really help people this way, just like the last presentation. And by designing with disabilities in mind, we create better products for everyone. It's really important to not think of disability as something that only affects a subset of users. It's not something you can really tell from your analytics. You can't see who's using a screen reader. There's really not a great way to see if users are tabbing through your website and only using keyboard navigation. So it's really important to think about everyone and thinking about including this all the time. And to not just think of disability as something that affects people permanently. Disability can affect anyone at some point in their life. Microsoft Design built out extensive and really fascinating guidelines on inclusive design. In it, they show the different states of accessibility or of disability, and it can really be all over the place, so we need to plan for that. Disability can be permanent, it can be temporary, situational. A user who might be using your website with a mouse one morning could have a baby in their arms later that night and might only be able to interact with it via the keyboard. So that's kind of a situational disability as opposed to somebody who might have a broken arm. So I get it. It can be really hard to advocate for accessibility in your workplace and build in the extra time to make sure it's important. But you've really just got to trust the facts. Analytics aren't going to show you that you're doing better, but it'll be better overall for your users. And it's better for business. Building accessible products will improve a lot of things, and a lot of the thinking about accessibility feeds into other web best practices that you are probably familiar with, like device independence. Things should work across different browsers. They should work across different devices. Your product should be usable for all types of users, older users who may not be tech savvy, or even people in other countries who might not be as tech savvy as we are. And then, of course, a word that all executives and clients like to hear, SEO. If a screen reader can access your site properly, so can Google's indexing. And case studies show that accessible websites are just better overall. They have better search results, they have reduced maintenance over time, and increased audience reach. And accessibility supports social inclusion, allowing us to hire more diversely and reach a diverse audience. And then there's, of course, scary legal things. So companies like Netflix, Sweetgreen have experienced lawsuits for having accessibility issues. Things like creating internal tools that employees are required to use to get their job done, if inaccessible, might mean that you can't hire as diversely as you should. Or it might mean you're disadvantaging disabled employees to do their job. This is really important for us at Vox Media because we create tools for our reporters to publish content and get news out into the world. And if we can't hire diversely, then we don't get those diverse voices. And many countries are recognizing and acting upon the need to ensure access to the web for people with disabilities. The common approach throughout the world is to adopt the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is developed through the W3C process and explains how to make content more accessible to people with disabilities. In the US, we have something called Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. So basically, it's a mandate for government agencies and federally funded nonprofits, colleges, schools, that they need to pass a certain level of accessibility, or they can get sued, they can lose funding, bad stuff. And in Australia, the World Wide Web Access Disability Discrimination Act Advisory Notes, which is a lot of words, requires equal access for people with disabilities where it can be reasonably be provided, which is similar to the US 508 compliance in that mandates like governments and banks and education sites to be accessible. And then for the European Union, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 21, prohibits discrimination based on the grounds of disability, among others. So if your site isn't accessible, it can be seen as discrimination. And then more, obviously, I wasn't going to go through all of the different countries. Everything is slightly different. So it's really important to be aware of the accessibility laws that pertain to your work. And if this somehow still doesn't convince your project stakeholders or project managers, just do it. Ask for forgiveness later. It's really not that complicated to build accessibility in, and no one is going to be mad at you for making your products more accessible, hopefully. So like I said, there's a lot of reasons to care about accessibility. And at Vox, we've grown a lot over the past few years. I think when I started, the product team was about 40 people. Now we're up to 150, and the whole company is probably close to 1,000. So we're building lots and lots of things for our colleagues and our users, and it's not really something we've ever really started to consider. We didn't really start until earlier this year in May. But we're already seeing big changes across the company. On the product team, we've always had advocates for accessibility. One of my coworkers created an accessibility channel in Slack, which is how you know it's official. So it was just kind of like a group of maybe 10 of us who would drop in links and share knowledge, and it didn't really go much past that for, I guess this was created in 2015, so for over a year. And we talked a lot in there to try to figure out how we could start including accessibility into our workflow. And at Vox, we have this yearly hackathon where the product team gets together. We're very remote, so we come into one place, and we have a hackathon where we can work on whatever we want. It's called Vox Hacks. And we can work on anything. I think somebody made an app this year that sends you GIFs of puppies every day. So it can really be very broad. And this is really successful. So we also have this thing we call mini Vaxes, which is where like a small group of people get together and can just kind of work on whatever they want. Our managers are pretty lenient about approving whatever. Not whatever, but reasonably. So I think 6 of us decided that we wanted to do like a mini hackathon to kind of scope out and figure out how we could all start including accessibility into our workflows. So we spent 2 days. Realistically, we all couldn't take too much time away from work to think about this, and we kind of wanted to time box it. And we knew we wanted to get some sort of training, so we asked someone from this agency in DC called Viget, and one of their front-end engineers came up to our office for a day, talked about all things accessibility, which was really, really helpful to see how they were including it into their process. So we spent 2 days brainstorming, we had a speaker, we wrote a whole bunch of documentation, and then we spent a lot of time planning how we would start spreading this across the company. So this is a screenshot of our Google Docs folder just for like our final documents. We wrote a lot of docs, I think there's 6, and we kind of broke it up based on role. So we have a document for engineers, we have a document for project managers, we have a document for quality assurance, designers, editorial, to make it a little bit easier to spread it across the team, and that way we wouldn't just like overload people with a whole bunch of documentation that would be really difficult for them to parse. And then with all of that, we also kind of came up with some guiding principles to help us frame like why we care about accessibility and why this is really important to us to consider and think about. So first one is people want to access our content and use our tools. Let's make it easy for them. We don't make assumptions about our users. As I mentioned before, it's really difficult to tell what disabilities may be affecting your users. This is where the industry is going, get on board or get left behind. And then accessibility is everyone's responsibility. This is important because we didn't want the 6 of us to just become like the accessibility police. We wanted to ensure that everybody understood the importance and wouldn't just expect us to call them out. We wanted everyone to really care. So this turned out to be really successful. We spread them around to our team. People read them, people loved them. We wrote best practices for editorial on our internal documentation website that we have. We ran knowledge shares and gave presentations to any team that would listen to us, and we shared it on our blog so that other companies could use it if they wanted. And we began to incorporate it into every single project. So this screenshot is an example of the Verge redesign, which was happening earlier this year, and the team that worked on that laid this out early on, like when thinking and picking about brand colors and things like that. And then probably the hardest part is trying to figure out how to keep people accountable. So one of the main things we came up with when we had that little hackathon was to start integrating our accessibility into our quality assurance process. So we met with our QA managers and our support managers and talked to them about how we could start testing for this stuff. We started treating it as other features in a project, so just as your requirements checklist, we added accessibility stuff in there too. And then celebrating wins. So for example, for the Verge redesign, which launched in March, we called out this was designed through a lens of accessibility, and this was really thoughtful and important to us. So since we had all these internal successes, we wanted to figure out how we could share this with the world and figure out how we could get other open source contributions from other people, and we figured that this was really useful for us, that it could be useful for everyone else. So luckily for us, we had that hackathon, which is every summer. So it was just a few months after. This was in July. So we spent 2 days fleshing out the guidelines and kind of figuring out how we wanted to share it. At first, we were just going to release all the documentation in some small open source website. But then we started to try to think of how we use the documents and what the best vehicle for that is. So we created this site, accessibility.voxmedia.com. Oh, yeah, this is a GIF of the site, kind of. So one of my teammates had started including accessibility checklists in each of her projects. So she would list out what the engineer would have to do and would add accessibility things for them to think about to that. And things for the QA people, and add accessibility into that. So because of how she was using these docs, we thought that making a checklist builder would be helpful for other people. So we have the site divided up into the same sections that we created for the documentation: designers, engineers, project managers, QA, editorial, and it allows you to select the items relevant to your project and outputs a list for you to copy. It also includes a bunch of links to resources and tools. And this was, people liked it, and I think people use it. I hope people use it. We got a bunch of open source contributions, and it's been really helpful for us. So that's pretty much the story of how we got it started at Vox Media. And now I'm going to hopefully give you all some practical advice that you can start using. So this is accessibility best practices for designers and developers. So this is an important one. Make sure there's enough contrast between the text and its background color. There's tons of tools to help figure this out. You don't have to just guess. And there's standards for it. Don't indicate important information using color alone. So this example is if you had a link in text and you just had the link a different color, or low vision users or people with color blindness won't even notice that that's a link. So adding something like an underline or maybe bolding it would help with that. Pairing values of color, not just hues, to increase contrast. It's always good to look at your stuff in black and white occasionally, just to kind of see. There's also tools for colorblind simulation. Designing accessible forms. This was kind of brought up in Ali's talk also. making labels very clear, having error messages that are very clear, not just using color. Very confusing and frustrating when you fill out a form and get an error but don't know why. And then from that, just building accessible forms. Always have labels for every input. Don't use placeholder text instead of a label. Labels shouldn't disappear on form focus. And then make sure to use field set and legend for larger forms. It's helpful for if users are using a screen reader and other assistive technology. Then use semantic HTML. Luckily for us, HTML is semantic by default. You kind of have to go out of your way to mess it up. Try not to nest unnecessarily elements like div inside a div inside a div inside a div. Like sometimes it's necessary, but it makes it a little more difficult for assistive tech to like parse the information. Use headings H1 through H6 for content structure. Avoid skipping headings in the same sections. And then it's okay to have multiple of the same heading on a page, just it's better to not have two H1s in like your first section. I think it used to be an SEO thing to not have more than one H1 on a page, but I don't think that holds true today. And HTML landmarks. So these help define specific areas that a user might want to seek out and can save them a bunch of time. So for example, if you're using a screen reader and need to skip to the navigation, this helps with that. The HTML5 elements like header, main, nav, footer, aside all have these built in, but if you're not using those, you can add role, banner, role, navigation, etc. To add that in. This is a pretty simple one. Your document should have a language attribute. This is good for SEO and screen readers just to know what language your page is in. Focus states. So you should absolutely never remove focus states from any of your buttons or links. I think the original CSS reset from Eric Meyer, like the first one, had this set to none, and so people just never overwrote it. It's since been updated. And then if you don't like the normal blue, you can kind of see it up there, focus color, you can design better ones, or you can just leave them as is. And then they should never be subtle, they should stand out. Users should be able to tell what item they're tabbed to and what they're focused on. This is, oh, you can't even really see it up there. But so on Google, for some reason, their search field doesn't have that blue focus state. It just darkens the drop shadow a little bit. And this is a great example of, like, that's not noticeable at all. And they really should have just left that blue glow. Knowing when to use buttons versus links. Linking to something outside the page, you should use an anchor tag. If you're performing an action on the page, like submitting a form, you should use a button. These are used differently with keyboards and screen readers. And then making links descriptive. If you just have a link that says click here, it is difficult for if the screen reader pulls out all the links on a page outside of the context of the text. Click here does not make any sense. And it's also really helpful for SEO to have descriptive content connected to the link. Should write good alt text for images and hide decorative images and not have bad alt text. So this is helpful for if your image doesn't load, this text is what will show up in its place. This is how non-sighted users will get descriptions of your images. And then if you have decorative images like a border, for example, you can add an attribute aria hidden, true, and that'll just hide that from people with assistive technology. Then accessible inline SVGs. So SVGs are used as icons, interactive elements. They should have a title or description, and then you can use aria labeled by attributes to tell the screen reader what element to use to describe the SVG. So this is an example of a green rectangle, probably not the most useful SVG, but it is labeled by the title. So if a user is using a screen reader, that's what they'll hear. And if an experience can't be made accessible, then create another route for assistive tech. Not everything is easily made accessible, so if you have like a really complicated interactive chart or graph, something like that, it might be better to have like an HTML table displaying that data, but just hidden on the page, but in the markup still, so that screen readers will still access it. As long as you don't display none on it, a screen reader will still pick it up. Allowing for viewport zooming, so a lot of people add this to their sites, and you can't zoom in or on your iPhone or on your desktop, which is really difficult and really obnoxious. And then supporting keyboard navigation. Users should be able to tab through your entire page. Don't allow for keyboard traps. If someone gets stuck somewhere on a page, they should always be able to back out of it. This happens a lot with modals and things like that. You enter into a modal and then there's no way to tab to click the button or exit, and it's really annoying. And just to remember that accessibility is everyone's responsibility. If you're a developer and getting inaccessible designs, don't hesitate to push back on them. Remember that semantic HTML goes a long way, and don't change default semantics. Don't make a link act like a button. All right, sounds like kind of a lot, so testing it is very important. So some best practices that I use in every single project is first, I start with navigating the page with my keyboard, making sure I don't get into any of those keyboard traps. I try to do this early because it's a lot more difficult to come in after the fact and fix this. Adding accessibility to your project checklist, just as you would any other function or feature. And then including accessibility in your browser QA process. And like I said before, testing early and often is key. So one of my favorite tools to use is this Totally bookmarklet. This basically, you just add it to your browser, click on it, and it'll show an overlay on the screen of all of the things wrong. This is an example of one of our sites at Vox Media, which is not perfect by any means, but you can scroll through it and click on the different things, and it will show you what isn't accessible and give you examples of how to fix it. It's really helpful. This one's good for as you're designing things, color contrast analyzer. I think it's a Mac app, but there's lots of tools like this online. So you can just paste in your color choices and it'll tell you if it's accessible or not. So that was kind of a lot of stuff. So to recap, disability affects everyone at any point. If you have trouble getting buy-in from executives and stuff, ask for forgiveness later. Just kind of do it if you have the time. It'll benefit you in the long run. And then baby steps count. It's not going to happen all at once. So we've been at this now for a few months, and that screenshot of kind of inaccessible curbed is still out there. Thinking about accessibility early and often is very important. Semantic HTML and browser defaults go a long way. Don't overwrite how the browser already works. And in general, let's just make our work better. So, thanks.